Greetings, everybody.
Welcome to the third Waterloo BRIDGECAST.
With your hosts,
Brandon.
Thomas.
And today's episode is actually going to be a little bit shorter because this guy's not feeling so great.
Sorry, guys.
And you'll actually notice that the setup here is very different. We're, in fact, sitting inside Thomas's house because he's not feeling so great.
Yeah, I just didn't want to go out in that -20 weather.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know, we are in Canada and we're in Cambridge. And it's a little cold out here, actually. It's like -20, -25. So it's pretty cold.
Another thing you guys should know is it's reading week right now, which means that a lot of people aren't around here. So we decided to get kind of lazy, get comfortable, and go to a slightly more private setting.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's saying that we can't have a nice, relaxed podcast here. In fact, that was kind of the whole way this started. Was we do this on a regular basis, so we're like, why don't we just get some microphones in here? So we usually use the storefront at 60 Main, but instead we're just here inside Thomas's house on his couch.
Yeah, it's cold at 60 Main, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wearing 2 pairs of socks right now in this house, and I got good heating, I'd say. It's not fantabulous, but it does the job.
Yeah, so I mean, the fact that it's cold outside means it's going to be ridiculously cold at the storefront, so we decided instead to shoot here and keep it light. I mean, nobody's here. The whole point of why we said it's reading week is there's like 6 of us in the school at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's not like even if we held it at 60 Main, like there would be a turnout like there was last week, but I guess
We're keeping the show on the road, though, so.
Yeah, it's important to talk and keep this consistency going.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'll say a few things on top of what we said there. If you're interested in coming out to watch us and participate in the conversation, we're always looking for people to come out and join in with us. So you can come to the storefront, which is in Cambridge at 60 Main. It's like not too far from where the school is. If you go to the school, University of Waterloo School of Architecture, you'll know that you'll know where it is. And we've done multiple events there before. So we shoot usually Wednesdays 5 to 6. You can come out and join in on the conversation, or if you just want to listen. Some people brought their dinner last time, right?
Yeah, you can eat there. It's a convenient time to pretty much grab food if you're going down Main Street.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you want to go to Bombay Grill or something.
Pick up some Indian food.
Yeah, pick up some food, come by and chill, get your takeout and relax.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you want to come and do some work, I think some people came and were sketching and working on their projects while they listened to us talk. So if you want a nice change of scenery, feel free to come out Wednesdays 5 to 6.
Yeah, it's an informal workspace, or it can be,
if
you try to choose it that way.
And I guess I'll make another statement too, that to explain what this is and why we're doing this. This is BRIDGECAST. It's a podcast that Thomas and I have put together to talk about world issues, current events, kind of whatever interests us at the time, right? And so BRIDGECAST belongs to a student group called Bridge, which is a student group inside the school where people, it's kind of an open platform it's a collection of students as an open platform to do whatever you'd like to do. So if you have a project or an idea you want to suggest, you'll sit down in a meeting, talk about it, and they'll say, that's great, let's do that. And so it's really nice and flexible in that sense that you can join projects that are kind of going on at the moment, or you can start something of your own, which is how this podcast came to be. So, and since starting this podcast, there have been a lot of people that have wanted to come and join and just even listen to us. So if you're one of those people that's listening to this that wants to come out, we would be glad to have you there.
Indeed, we would be. Anyway, so what are we going to talk about this week, Brando? What's the agenda?
Well, originally we were keeping with the schedule we had last week. We should have had Kareem and Kamal and Kuni on for On Empathy this morning or this afternoon, but because it's reading week and not everybody's really here, we're going to push the On Empathy updates to next week. And there's not too many people here. There's nobody here, just us, to commentate with us. So we're going to keep it light, probably down to 2 topics. I was reading an article the other day about a shooting. I think it was in Washington State that we were going to talk about a little bit.
Washington State or DC?
I think this was Washington State.
Okay.
This was definitely Washington State. Yeah. And then we were going to maybe talk about
Ukraine. But but that's a very difficult topic to talk about. There's just so many updates left and right.
Well, the big one that sparked our interest in wanting to talk about this one was the recent ceasefire agreement that was reached and implemented the other day, right?
On February 15th, yes.
On February 15th.
It was, from my understanding, only partially implemented.
Well, wait, do you want to start with that, or do you want to start with the shooting?
Let's start with the shooting first. Yeah.
Okay. The shooting happened, I don't remember when it was, I don't remember the date exactly, but essentially what the details are of the incident were that there was a man that was throwing rocks at cars in a grocery store parking lot. And so the police were phoned in and called to the area, and he started throwing rocks at the police as well.
Yeah, just to make it clear, everybody, these rocks were apparently softball size, so they were rather large.
Well, some of them were softball size. There's a lot of articles, and some of the information isn't exactly right. One article claims something, the other article claims something different. But the gist of what was happening was that he was throwing rocks at cars, and then when the police showed up, he started throwing rocks at them. And they had asked him to kind of put his hands up, and that's when he started to run away. And as he was running, I think he was also throwing rocks too. Is that right?
Well, he was running away, and then he turned around, and I think he threw another rock or something like that.
Either
He basically continued throwing rocks at the police
while he was running away. And the interesting part of the story is that he got to a point where he was kind of facing away from the officers as he was running, and he stopped. And as he turned around, I think there was 3 or 4 officers on the scene, and they shot him down.
But he had his hands up though.
He had one hand up, and one hand had kind of started to drop towards his waist. So in some of the articles that I was reading, the police in their reports had claimed that they were concerned he'd be reaching for a weapon. And so that's why they shot him. But there's a lot of pieces of information in this story that I found to be particularly interesting, and talking points to kind of, talk about police enforcement, especially in North America. Within the past year, there's been a lot of incidences that have happened where the level of police, where the level of force that the police have used is oftentimes in question.
Yeah, it's seems like it's particularly brutal, but also in this article they were mentioning the fact that basically this person, he was running around, and they tried to use tasers on him, but the reason why he ran away is because these tasers were not effective, according to what they said. What does that really mean? No one really understands, but basically he was still able to move around and run, and I guess pose a threat, which is why potentially they stopped using the tasers at the final showdown, you can say.
Right, but I mean, I do have I read an article where they said they used tasers and they didn't use tasers. Let's hypothetically go with it. They did use tasers the first time, and it didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
When he stopped and he started to turn around, that would have been, a more ideal opportunity to use tasers at that point, because the issue I'm wrestling with a little bit is that I think it didn't require 3 police officers to shoot, an excess of 4 bullets per person to disarm this person and then arrest him.
Of course not.
Their focus should have been to arrest him, and instead they decided to shoot him dead because it's probably a lot easier and required.
Well, I don't know if it's a lot easier per se. Like, yeah, I guess maybe physically it's easier to pull a trigger, but come on, like.
Sorry, when I said easier, I meant like that they may have thought in that time that it was the better solution, but
I don't even know if they're really thinking. It's happening really, really quickly. It's happening so fast. It's more of an impulsive sort of decision, I think, that people make. The problem is that people have the power to kill somebody at their fingertips. And when there's 4 people with that power,
mm-hmm.
then it only takes 1 out of those 4 people to make a mistake like that. It's just a huge responsibility, right?
Sure.
And when you're not thinking about something that you have to be super responsible about, things can get out of hand.
Okay, I guess that much is true. I'm more wrestling with the concept of the police using too much force. It didn't require 3 people to shoot him. You could have had 1 officer, shoot him in the leg to disarm him, and you would have achieved probably a better result.
Of course not, but the problem is that these people are armed. There's places in the world such as Holland where some police officers don't even carry any guns. They just walk around without guns. And these situations don't happen nearly as often in places like that.
Well, I think that's actually getting to the point and kind of the root of what I'm talking about, is that like in other parts of the world, like I remember reading something the other day that I think it was might have been in Norway, but it was in a Scandinavian country where police have only shot and killed one person in the past like year or two, and that police officers don't travel armed usually. Mm-hmm. And that because they don't travel armed, there's not this need, or there's not this feeling that people need to be armed if they're on the streets. Like, because like violence doesn't perpetuate in that sense. Like, because police officers aren't armed, there's probably less criminals that are armed. That kind of concept. Where here in the States, a point that was referenced in this article is that it's a very similar case to the Ferguson shooting.
Yeah.
Where 18 I think it was 18 or 19 years old.
Mm-hmm.
He was shot essentially running away from the police, and that ensuing that shooting, the entire police force in that city, Ferguson,
Missouri, yeah.
In Ferguson, kind of militarized themselves, and when you look at the pictures, they look like army soldiers that are walking the streets, but yet they're the local police force. And in the officers kind of arming themselves, the community armed themselves as well. And so it's just continually stacking effect of one side arming themselves, the other side arming themselves more, and the other side needing to feel that they need to compensate for that. Where I think that if they didn't go with that approach and they tried to keep things very peaceful and they didn't bring weapons into the situation, I think that you wouldn't have had the same backlash from the community in that sense, or at least the backlash wouldn't have been as violent, and conversations could have been had, instead of the violence that happened. So similar to this case as well, there were a lot of people that were protesting, saying that he was shot when he was surrendering himself, and that there was an excessive use of police force.
Yeah, but don't you think a lot of this stems from paranoia, though? That people are armed in order to make sure situations like this don't happen, but you're saying it has the opposite effect. I think that if realistically we're going to say that police officers are not armed, mm-hmm. and that civilians don't need to arm themselves because they're not armed, mm-hmm. that whole idea would require a whole shift in society for that to happen. Like, it's not like you go out in the street and know that these 4 police officers are not armed. You don't know that. You don't expect mm-hmm. that. Because here in North America, you just understand that police are armed. You see their gun. It's supposed to be visible on their belt. Mm-hmm. And you know what they do with it. You know they're trained. Mm-hmm. And they will use it if there's a danger posed to them.
Right.
Like, you basically would have to require a change in the whole way that the police functions and the way that society understands police and everything for both sides to become more moderate about the way they use weapons.
Sure. I'll agree to that. But I'm just thinking more in like a hypothetical sense, because when you look at like even England, I think a lot of or British officers aren't armed with a handgun. They're armed with like a club or something like that.
Okay.
Right. And so when you think about that, think of a situation in which you have a police officer and they're confronting a criminal, and neither of them are armed. That means that the chance of death is going to be probably significantly less, and that the violence isn't going to be as explosive as it would be if a gun was involved, right?
Well, I don't know if explosive is the right word, because this type of violence is it's like what we talked about with drones. Like, it just makes killing way too easy. It's not even violence. You get to a point where it's just like one move, one pull of the trigger, and then the violence is over pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. It's just a single event. It's just like poof, done. Mm-hmm. I would say that if police officers had batons, that's when you would actually get violence, fist fights, some sort of altercations.
Sure, but nobody would die. The amount of deaths would probably drop significantly, because after you get beaten once or twice with a club, you're not really going to want to jump back up and continue fighting.
That's true, but I think the argument would be that the police like to have the advantage, right? The rules are in their favor, that they're the ones that are allowed to legally own a gun while they're on patrol or whatever. There are certain regulations implying that they have to have a visible and they have to be trained and yada, yada, yada. But they're the ones with the gun. You as a citizen are not the one with the gun. The advantage is in their favor.
Sure. But in seeing the police officers have a weapon, you as a citizen actually can legally arm yourself within certain regulations, and you can purchase only certain weapons for specific uses. Sure. But, I don't know. I'm going in circles here and saying this, but I think that if you see that a police officer is armed, you're going to think, "Ooh, I should probably arm myself too," in that sense.
Well, I don't know if it's that extreme, but potentially, like if you look at the G20 summit, some anarchists came prepared for that. People know that there's going to be riot police, and they're going to throw whatever sort of smoke bombs and things like that. They come with shields, they come with batons, and the whole shebang. Yeah, certain people arm themselves because they know they have to cover their identity. They know they might have to wear a mask. They know they might have to like put on something so that they don't get like tear gas in their face. They know these things. Yes, sure, they arm themselves in terms of defense. I think that like a gun is just a very, very sort of it just really doesn't leave you enough time to think. That's the problem. It's just too quick, too easy. It's just instantaneous. I think that in violence, like in traditional violence, there's strategy involved that takes a little bit longer. Sure, it could be like fractions of a second longer, but you make more conscious decisions, I think, because while you're getting beaten with a baton, like you have to pull your hand back and then go in for another sort of swing, like you're conscious of that. When you have 4 people that are on the same page about like pulling a trigger, it's like everything happens so quick. No wonder we're seeing articles here that say one thing happened here and another thing happened here. These officers themselves probably don't know who killed the guy first.
Well, sure, granted, I agree with that, and you did bring up an interesting point about having more time if you're not using a gun, and that it's too quick. But I think part of this too is training, because I don't remember where I was reading this, but there's other police forces, I think, in Europe that their training is to focus on not hitting center of mass, but hitting like an arm or a leg or something to disarm the person that they're chasing.
Yeah.
Versus like a lot of North American police, their traditional training is to aim for center of mass when they're shooting. So there you have 2 very different schools of thought, so to say, in police training, where one is fatal and the other one is more in the likes of disarming.
Yes.
So I think you can still use a gun as a police officer and use it. Like, I mean, they're supposed to have them, as you said, to have the upper advantage. But I think that there's other ways for them to use those, not to kill people, but to disarm, if that's what they're doing. I mean, there's tons of cases. You can look at the Ferguson case. You can look at this case. There was the case that happened here in Toronto on the TTC with Sammy 18, where the police officers. I don't think a taser was even considered, and in trying to disarm somebody who had a pocket knife, they shot and killed him when you could have hit the arm that had the pocket knife and then arrested him from that point. Like, I think it's the mentality, especially in the States. Like,
but maybe it's not mentality per se. Like, yeah, maybe they are trained like that. I really don't know the details about these things, but don't you think it's emotion? Don't you think that it's the fear on the police officer's side that rules out in this situation?
I don't think so. I think that's part of their training, is to not freak out in an instance like that, where if you take a
But you don't know that's actually going on. When you're being trained, you're in an artificial environment where you have ensured a sense of safety. And it's basically like a fire drill. If there's no real fire, people walk like in line, they go down the stairwell and everything's all good. But if there's a real fire, like, look at like what happened in 9/11. People were jumping like from stairwell to stairwell, falling off and everything, like going over people's heads. People don't behave orderly when there's a real situation at hand, despite the training that they've gained.
Sure, but I mean, like, the police force has to be held to a certain level of standard, and I agree that, like,
of course,
in a real environment, like you're going to behave differently than when you do in training. But the whole point of training is to train you to behave a specific way in those situations, regardless of whether you're in training or you're actually in that scenario.
Yeah, but call me a skeptic, but I really don't think that this actually works the way that you describe it to work. There are so many things that we should perform as we are being instructed in, but we don't. We just don't.
Mm-hmm.
You can go into so many examples. Like you can look at how people defraud the government, don't pay their tax, yada yada yada.
Mm-hmm.
That's another form of basically saying like, okay, I know that I should be, acting like a citizen that would pay taxes, wouldn't perform fraud or anything like that, but people still do it. They hide it.
Mm-hmm.
There are movies written about this.
That's true.
There are whole court cases where people figure out 20 years later, oh my God, this guy's been like scamming money off people. There are people in Toronto. There's this recent, I think it was like 6 months ago or something like that. They found out that people were basically milking new condo owners of cash into a condo project that actually didn't get built. So they took some of their money of their deposit and then they ran away. This is some woman from Hong Kong or China or something like that, and then she ran away after they didn't build a condo.
Mm-hmm.
So this doesn't necessarily have to do with guns. People know the rules. People know how they should behave. People are trained to act a certain way. That doesn't mean that when emotion is involved, that is going to happen, especially when the emotion is something like fear.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, sure, they have to perform to a certain standard. Yes, but that doesn't mean people don't cover up their tracks, and it doesn't mean that people think rationally when they have literally a split second, not even, to decide on what to do. Maybe they didn't even consciously think about it. Maybe it was just like literally like, I don't know, just a signal to your muscle. Maybe it was something like that by the time you thought about it, oh my God, it's too late. You know what I mean?
Maybe.
Like people will tell you that emotions are stronger than rational thought. And I think in a time of stress, you can't argue that this was not stressful for the police officers. I'm sure that despite the amount of training that you have, if you had a job where every single, let's say for the duration of every single hour, you had a situation like this, it would still be stressful. Now, this doesn't happen every day for them. This happens pretty often, but it's not something that happens as often as they're training, let's say. While they're training, they're repeating the same steps over and over and over again and trying to drill this information into their head so that they know how to react for a situation like this. Some of these people might not even have this situation ever. So I know for a fact that this thing is probably stressful. And when you're stressed, let's just say that rational thought might not be something that comes across in your decision making. And that's what I think is important here. The fact that people have this weapon that is coupled with emotion. And when you take something that requires a huge sense of responsibility, either on the police department's side as a whole or on the individual, but they have the power to do something as significantly crazy as that, that's a dangerous situation. It's like having countries with atomic bombs, right?
True.
Think about how much we talk about like how worried we are that there are certain nations that are finding out that they are capable of having some nuclear technologies available to them, and how much discussion is being talked about not having these other countries. I'm not going to name which, but we all know who. But anyway, think about how dangerous that looks like to everyone else.
Sure.
The more people that have access to such technologies, such as a gun or whatever, a nuclear weapon, it doesn't matter. It's the responsibility that is important here. And people are not rational. That's just, yeah, sure, we like to be, and we can, in generally safe situations, we can make rational decisions. But I think as soon as that sense of safety is taken away from you, which is a non-training situation, despite how much training you did have, people will compromise. People will come up with crazy things. And this is not necessarily a police situation. This is a situation that can stem into many different fields. Yes, we could talk about architecture here, for example. We recently watched that film with Iwan Bond, the photographer, who went to this guy's an architectural photographer. His name's Iwan Bond. He pretty much takes pictures of a lot of very significant works of architecture across the globe. So he gets to travel a lot. Anyway, this guy was traveling to Colombia, where he went to Bogota and he saw a huge office tower that was not complete.
I don't think this was in Colombia. I think this was in Venezuela.
Venezuela, Venezuela, excuse me. But in Venezuela, he climbed to this office tower that was not complete for various reasons, economical and political.
Mm-hmm.
And people started to live inside and make makeshift housing in between columns and sheer walls of this building. And I think this is kind of related to what we're talking about here, that once people have a choice to sort of like find their own niche, they will do it. They'll be crafty and they'll come up with creative ways to shape their environment and to make decisions without any sort of real sort of structure in place.
Mm-hmm.
So these police officers, despite the fact that they've had like probably a very strict way to deal with situations like this and a whole sort of way of upbringing that they understand on paper, I'm sure that when these situations happen, that they might, I'm not saying they did, but I'm just saying that they might not behave or perform as they were instructed. And that is definitely a possibility. We shouldn't just discount that as impossible, because I'm pretty sure the police department doesn't say like kill people when they're throwing rocks, you know?
No, yeah.
And you're saying that the police department has to be held to a higher standard. That is true. I'm sure the police department does a good job, but you know, these things happen. Maybe it might not be the fault of the police department itself.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying that they have to have training and this and that. That much is very true. But you also have to look at the individual. Like I don't know if you can label the whole department.
No, I wasn't looking to label the entire department. Like what I was speaking to was more the mentality in a lot of North American police officers of being heavily militarized, and their first thought is to kill instead of disarm, because there are so many. I mean, there's probably just as many cases of police officers looking to disarm people as there are police officers who have killed people in instances like these. But the thing is that I feel that there's more situations where police officers wind up shooting and killing somebody instead of disarming them. And I think that's part of the whole mentality of like, you know, aim for the chest, not the arm, where like the arm is going to disarm them and give you that extra time to go and arrest them, tackle them to the ground, whatever that may be. I do think that while the police department is responsible for, you know, instances like these, I'm not saying that they are the only people that are accountable and that the individuals in this scenario are a factor. No, I agree with all that. But
yeah, this is a difficult one. But I also think that, I really don't know what to say about this anymore.
Well, why don't we move on then to the ceasefire, talking about things that they do but shouldn't be doing, maybe might be doing, or whatnot.
Well, I don't know. I guess this is a really interesting situation. I was watching Vice. I know it's not the best source, but... Well,
actually, we'll give some background, like what does the ceasefire mean? And
okay, so basically they had the Minsk ceasefire earlier, which was pretty much a whole roundup of European politicians, including Russia's President Putin, in the Belarusian capital, discussing terms about a ceasefire agreement, which would mean that the Ukrainian forces and the pro-Russian / Russian, whatever you want to call them, forces, would not fire or attack each other. That one failed, so they have another one now, which I think was pretty much put into practice on February 15th. And there have been a couple breaches of that ceasefire. Pretty much on, I don't exactly know which side or who it is. The details are very complicated. There have been breaches, but basically all the sources say different stories about who initiated, who started this and that. But what we can decipher is that the ceasefire overall hasn't basically worked.
Well, is it that it's been a complete failure and hasn't worked, or has it been a serious reduction in the amount of attacks that have happened inside Ukraine there? Because I do remember reading an article saying that leading up to the ceasefire, that there was an increase in fighting that had happened, or there was an increase in fighting leading up to the ceasefire, and that in that time, pro-Russian forces were rolling in tanks and other armaments into Ukraine.
Yes, I have heard of this, and they supposedly captured one village that was held by Ukrainian forces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the thing is with this situation is it's a very, very tough one. Like, you basically have to understand that people in that region can be very mixed in terms of descent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very hard to split one side from another. Even if you watch any of these videos, like, there's some good ones on Vice about what's happening on the ground.
Yep.
Whether people end up on either sides. I've heard a story of like one Ukrainian soldier in a hospital, a makeshift sort of hospital on the pro-Russian side. Sorry. And because they spared his life, all of a sudden he's slightly more favorable to their side. Like, people basically change their position. People can change their position daily.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really difficult to say like who's doing exactly what. There have been also, if you watch the same videos on Vice, you'll see that people end up killing supposedly groups on either side despite the ceasefire agreement. And if you talk to people, I haven't, but if you watch these videos, you'll see that a lot of them comment saying that they don't think the ceasefire is going to last, and that they think that both parties are trying to build up temporary resources and work out some sort of strategy to come up with further attacks in the future.
Mm-hmm.
The Ukrainian side got hit pretty bad, apparently, over the last week.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them have retreated further into Ukraine. It's kind of interesting. If you look at the situation, no side will actually tell you the real numbers. Because if one side says, oh, X amount of people died, the other side will say, no, actually, it's X minus 1. They really don't want to give you the real numbers, because that starts like misconstruing facts and creating propaganda for one side or another.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really actually hard to see like what sort of damage has happened, whether or not more people died or less people died, or if people were displaced or whatever. We just know that people have been displaced. We're not certain about the numbers.
Well, okay, let me ask you a question, because you're probably more versed in this than I am. Seen as the first ceasefire, the Minsk ceasefire, that it had failed, and I think that was September that was implemented. It was sometime in the fall, right?
Okay.
Seen as that one has failed, and now there's talk that this ceasefire that has just passed on February 15th might also fail as well too, and that, as you'd said, they're just simply allowing time for either side to kind of rearm themselves and re-strategize. Yeah. Why do you think that there is going to be an end to the conflict? I mean, obviously all things come to an end, but if they keep putting up...
You mean in the near future?
I mean in the near future. If they keep putting up ceasefires and keep doing more ceasefires, another ceasefire, and they keep breaking them, like, is there not like a better way to address the root problem of the situation?
Okay, so... I hate to stress this situation again, but like I said, like, if you watch some of these Vice videos on the ground, it's called like Russian roulette in Ukraine or something like that. If you watch the latest ones, like any of the recent dispatches, and you see them talking to the people that are actually involved in this conflict,
mm-hmm.
they all say that they don't really see an end in sight, because they don't want an end in sight right now.
Okay, but why is that? Why doesn't
some of the militants don't want, like the locals, if you watch the videos, the locals, a lot of them are just like, yeah, I'm kind of over this. This is annoying. Some of the militants want it to end too, and then there's others that don't want it to end. And if you look at this situation in parallel to what happened with Gaza and Israel this past summer, they also had a couple times where they were going to have a ceasefire, and then it continued again. Rockets were fired on like both sides, and one side was responding to another, etc. Eventually that one ended, but you were mentioning solving the root of the problem. The root of the problem is not what happened recently. Like, if you look at what both sides are saying, Russia's saying like, no, this land we had as part of our empire, and this was hundreds of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And Ukraine saying, well, we're defending our native homeland, like, and this is our land. And then there's developments that happened in the 50s, like, with, for example, Soviet leaders giving away Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that was just or not, or whether that was a good decision, what that implies now, because the Soviet Union collapsed in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So, so you have modern borders that maybe don't reflect what they should be reflecting, or people. Let's just say that people might not agree with the way that the modern borders have been drawn.
Sure.
Because of the fallout over situations in history.
Mm-hmm.
And the root of the problem is not something that happened in the past 2 years. The root of the problem is something that's a lot deeper and has stretched longer than that. That I think these ceasefires, a ceasefire does not mean, okay, let's sit down and start problem solving. A ceasefire is just like, okay, let's stop for a moment. If you want to start problem solving, that's going to require years. It's going to require looks back into time, looks at what the people want right now,
mm-hmm.
etc. For example, like if you look at Gaza and Israel, yeah, sure, they stopped firing rockets at each other. Do they love each other? Are they best friends now? Are they like opening up that border in Gaza and all of a sudden becoming like one nice peaceful nation? No, the people there have just calmed down for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know anything about that situation, these things just rekindle. It's like a little ember.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
That like, yeah, sure, they went ablaze and now maybe we put out the fire for a bit, but it still doesn't mean that the fire is completely gone. There's just a little ember there at the bottom of some dry grass that's just waiting to like capitalize on some opportunity that might burst into flames again.
Mm-hmm.
And until you put out that last ember, that last little spark, by having a real discussion, by actually getting to the root of the problem, these things are just going to spring up. And what we see is the same problem. It's just been set ablaze right now. It's ablaze.
Okay.
So even if this conflict stops, it's not going to stop at a dinner table. You know what I mean?
No. I get that. Yeah.
And it might just come up again in the future. We really don't know about that. And some people have been, certain articles, like if you read any of the BBC articles right now
mm-hmm.
about Putin's stance on this, they claim that Putin wants to have this region of instability inside Ukraine itself proper. That they're arguing, the BBC is arguing, and The Guardian as well, by the way,
mm-hmm.
they're arguing that Russia doesn't want to necessarily annex Luhansk and Donetsk, these regions of Ukraine. That what they want is to create a region of instability within Ukraine in order to meddle within their politics and to keep all of Ukraine in their sphere of influence.
Mm-hmm.
And this is pretty much just speculation, but they might not be interested in just severing these two pieces, absorbing it into Russia's sphere of influence, because if they create a zone of instability, all of Ukraine, which is a relatively big country,
could potentially be also in the same
realm
of instability.
Yeah, maybe they're not. The rest of Ukraine is not Russia's friend. Yeah, but because they have like, we could say like a parasite or something inside.
Mm-hmm.
That parasite obviously affects the whole.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, they might not just want to get rid of that parasite.
Mm-hmm.
Is what I'm saying. But this is also just some sort of speculation that's been going around the interwebs these days, and
mm-hmm.
we don't know how it's going to play out. But yeah, it's a very interesting topic. I think it's worth following in the near future.
Yep. And more on that too. I definitely think that a lot of the topics we've talked about in the past we can certainly bring up in future.
Yeah, which actually brings me to a very interesting point here.
Mm-hmm.
That last week we were talking about drones.
Yeah.
And it's funny because there have been videos posted online with apparently Ukrainian military personnel crafting their own drones out of pretty much makeshift parts here and there, and then flying it over these rebel-held territories and taking pictures as to what's going on the ground, so that they know how to plan for whatever sort of attack or defense that they're going to engage in,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of interesting, because that also goes back to what we were talking about with the police officers, that people are crafty. People might not have very much, but
Yeah.
in these times of desperation and like I said, when emotion takes over, clearly this Ukrainian conflict is a very emotional sort of situation for the people there.
Mm-hmm.
That when emotion takes over, people will find ways to come up with crazy things that you thought would potentially not even happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of interesting that out of literally nothing, like they're destroying whole airports there in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Whole airports with gates and everything. So in that sense, like, aviation is pretty much going downhill, but on the small scale, they're building these drones out of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, out of the ashes, that sort of field is, you could say, in a sense, prospering. It's kind of ironic.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's like desperation is the mother of ingenuity.
exactly. So I think, which tells you a lot about our society here in I guess you could say the Western world or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
that we're not particularly desperate. We
it's true.
live very stable lives, and
Yep.
thank goodness for that. But it leads you to think as what you could do
Mm-hmm.
if you were in a situation like that. I think these situations are obviously not inherently good, but they do teach people certain values and certain things that maybe you didn't even know you were good at something, and then you pretty much have to do something to contribute to a particular cause.
Yeah.
Whether that cause is good or bad, whatever, that's another discussion. But in a sense, like, your productivity is very easily quantifiable based on how you're contributing. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And when time is not on your side because of a very desperate sort of situation, that you might find things that are just amazing that you happen to be good at, which you would never otherwise know.
Well, it's the same here in architecture school. Like, I remember when we were doing something in first year for an environmental project, and we had to do those solar studies. And
Yes.
like overnight here, people teach themselves software and skills that they need to complete their project. People aren't necessarily limited by the things that they already know. If you want to do something, or you want to get a specific outcome out of your project, you'll teach yourselves very quickly the steps you need to get that, which I think kind of goes back to this. While we're not necessarily desperate in the sense that, people in Ukraine and Russia are desperate, therefore there's ingenuity emerging out of that. I think that people here are, you could say, almost desperate to get the result they want, or they have a specific focus in mind of how they want something to look or how they want something to function, that they'll do what's necessary to achieve that result.
Yeah, in a sense, we kind of suffer here too. We don't eat, we don't sleep, we don't shower sometimes.
That's predominantly around deadline time for those that are potentially looking to come to the school.
And I guess you can call that a time of desperation.
Yeah.
Because time is really not on your side there.
Nope.
And it's kind of interesting because you really do prioritize. And maybe your project takes the priority over you showering for that particular case. And you get a whole room of people that made that decision, and there's a consequence to that. We all just laugh it off, but
Yeah.
that's a very, very light comparison to, I guess, what's going on in other regions of the world. And it's great that we can laugh about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
At least, I mean, on our end of the table here. It's quite sad, actually, what's going on in some other areas, to be honest.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
But it's at least good that, like, it's nice to see the silver lining in everything. So it's kind of cool to point out that in destruction, in total chaotic destruction,
Mhm.
there's still some good and some ingenuity that comes out.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think there's one thing I want to touch on before we close here, that you had kind of started to talk about, that I mentioned in the last one, but that here in North America and other parts of the world where people like ourselves are very privileged to not have that desperation to survive, and that we all do live in a fairly stable environment, I am also incredibly thankful for the fact that we can very calmly sit down and do this and talk about, world issues, politics, architecture, whatever it is we feel like talking about, without there being restriction or criticism or harsh actions on the part of like the government or other people.
Well, criticism is okay, but
Sure.
maybe we're alluding to the fact that we really want to say censorship then.
Well, censorship and just the freedom to talk about whatever we wish to talk about without fear of being censored or killed for saying things,
Or having rocks thrown at us.
Well, I think that's something different. But what I'm trying to say is I'm thankful for the freedom of speech that we have, and that we aren't in a desperate state here, at least in North America.
Yeah, but that might very quickly change. Let's just be happy that it is the case for now.
Sure.
Because honestly, the way the world is going these days, you never know.
Yeah, that's
Never
true.
know. That's why we're talking about certain issues that happen in North America too, such as the police these days.
Yeah.
Because who knows? Like that might spread and become. I'm not saying the police or anything, but I mean any sort of event or something here could spread like a tumor on our continent as well, and we don't know like the implications. Like I'm being a little bit of an over exaggerator here, I know, but.
No, there's valid points to what you're saying.
Like anything can happen, really.
Yeah.
And so I think it's worth talking about some issues that are also close to home.
Exactly.
And draw
Yeah.
parallels between things that happen abroad and things that happen here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's actually a good place to wrap up. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. It's getting dark and I'm hungry.
Yeah. So we will plan to do this next Wednesday from 5 to 6 at 60 Main in the storefront there.
Yep. Same city, same friends, if you look.
So if you're interested in coming out, you can come out to 60 Main next Wednesday from 5 to 6 and join in on the conversation. Additionally, too, we usually post the topics that we plan on talking about on Monday, so that way people have a sense of what to expect on the podcast. But if you would like to suggest something that we should talk about, you can either approach myself or Thomas, or you can add to the post that's made about what is going to be said on Wednesday.
Or surprises. Come down.
Yeah.
Research your topic. Like they're available, so you guys can look at some things beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
Come to the show. We'll pass the mic around. It'll move down into the audience and join the discussion. It's nice to have somebody other than Brandon speak, and vice versa. I know he'll say the same thing. So
yeah, that's probably very true.
So I think just sit down, take the mic, and let us know what you think.
Yep. And it's always nice to have more voices jump in on the conversation here. So
yeah. Especially if we can get a laugh track.
Okay, maybe. Yeah. So I guess with that, I'm Brandon.
I'm Thomas.
And we'll see you guys next week.